I began discussing photography with this image. What is it?
Circus?
It's what?
Never mind.
You're guessing. This is not a test question. What do you see?
Bunch of walls, a lot of girls. Swimmers at the beach.
Bathing girl revives.
It's
Galveston.
2016 to
bathing
1922.
girl.
If you read the sign in it, it gives you, of course, a very good clue. Third Annual Bathing Girl Review, Galveston, Texas, May 14th, 1922. A lot of photographs, when they have all that sort of information, you really help you with identification. We curators like that when they give us those clues like that in the picture. But let's go a little bit deeper than that, too. We see a number of ladies in bathing suits. You've got the title now in front of you. If it were better in focus, you could see the name of the photographer, E.O. Goldbeck, San Antonio. He was the photographer of the image. But let's do Sherlock Holmes a little better now. Let's just not see, what do you observe in this picture as well? Anything about its shape? What?
Panoramic.
Yes, very good. Panoramic image. How do you make a panoramic image? Yeah. They had specially designed cameras in the day. That was taken by a camera called a circuit camera. It turned around this big circular base. The film unwound past a slit in the back, and you could take up to 360 degrees with it. When you turned it on, it moved and made the exposure for you as well. So, yes, we know the tool, which is specialized. You don't have the object in front of you, so you can't see, but it's about 6 inches tall and runs about, 3 feet, and covers that particular image. What else can you surmise about the picture? Anything about why it was made?
Attract tourism.
Tourism?
To attract it.
Could be, definitely. Does the word bathing girl review imply anything to you?
Sports Illustrated.
Sports Illustrated. Well, could be, could be. Let's ask ourselves another question about this. Why do you think Goldbeck made it?
He was paid too.
Yes, Goldbeck was a commercial photographer. He made the image. Do you see his potential market in the image?
Men.
Men. And also perhaps the subject matter as well. To tell you a little bit more about Goldbeck, as a commercial photographer, he charged $3 a head back in those days for one of these circuit panoramas when he took your group picture. If you stood on the end and after the camera swept past you, you ran behind him and got on the other end, so you were in the picture twice, he'd charge you double. He was a smart capitalist as well. He made a living successfully out of this project as well. You can get some sense of his commercial enterprise if you look at this particular picture, because the Goldbeck Company still works today. This, by the way, is a photograph by our esteemed other photographer, Dan Bonnevac's wife, Beverly. I love it because not only does it show the contraption in which they have to travel from site to site to show you the work of the thing, but also you see people using traditional cameras and cell phones as well to take pictures too. So the camera technology changes and it's all encompassed in one sort of image. Very good catch on that one too. Socially, culturally, anything else about the image in particular? What is a bathing girl review?
This is a beach.
Does it imply any sort of, I don't know, contest?
Pageant.
Right, swimsuit competition in the 20s. Very good. If Mr. Goldbeck were with us alive today, he would tell us as well that all these ladies also, these are handmade beach costumes too. Which implies, I wonder about the lady who actually sewed all the shells onto her costume, because one of them is blanketed in shells. Unfortunately, this document does not tell us anything about who won the contest. We don't know that, at least not in this factor. So you have to research it if you're going to find it. Finally, something else about it. Let's think about that circuit camera, because you're sort of arranged in an arc in here as well. If you're going to try and get a straight line of people, and you're going to mount them together, and they're going to cover, let's say, 120 degrees, or maybe even 180 degrees, and the camera goes in that same arc, how do you get a straight line?
Has to be the same distance from the camera all the way around.
Yes, very good. We have an optics physics student in the class as well. Good. That is the type of mechanism that he used, the type of procedure he used. It also means that any building with a straight line behind it tended to look curved when it was photographed in the book, as you can see somewhat from the balconies of the building behind it. Well, I'd go on and mark out other things too, like these hats and this camera here in the front show there were other photographers taking this picture as well, so there may be other pictures of this too. I'd ask why he scratched out and put this etching over the top of one thing, and it looks like he tried to cover up a photographer who got in the way of his camera at the time he made the exposure. There's all sorts of suppositions you can bring to the use of the photograph when you look at it. And all those sort of things are what I want you to be aware of when you come to a photograph. Because, oh yeah, there's one other thing about that picture too. That's probably one of the most successful images we have in the HRC, not in terms of the great history of the world or anything, but in terms of just sales. It's a very popular image. The nostalgia of it's very popular with a lot of people. But we had one researcher come in and buy 3 copies. Not because of the bathing beauties, not because he was interested in Goldbeck, not because he was interested in even in photography per se. But it turns out he was a historian of umbrellas. And according to him, that picture has 19 different styles of parasols and umbrellas in it. I didn't count them, I don't know. But here's the difference. Since that day, and he told me that, I can't see that image quite the same way. And now that I've told you, you can't either. That's what photography does, that immediate process of making an image if you're the photographer, observing it if you're in the audience. Not only do you see, but you bring your own experience to the photograph. And as we go through the history of photography and the history of imagery, that's what's invited in this work as well. The fact that it's not written down in words. There are words about it, there are ways we express it. Certainly when we talk about it, we use words. But the image presented to you is visual, and it invites your own participation, your own interpretation. And that's what I want you to carry with you when you look at images for the next semester. Because those things occur. Your opinions count. What you see counts as well. The presentation of imagery goes back to prehistoric man, but we've always tried to graphically show things, whether it's sketching with the pencil or the pen, trying to record faces in the pre-photographic days with portrait painting, or in this case with making silhouettes, etchings, engravings to use multiple reproductions because we weren't satisfied with just the one original. We wanted to be able to reproduce multiple forms, and of course paintings with their own unique expression and their own power throughout this age. In 1839, when photography was presented to the world by Louis-Jacques Daguerre, the painter Paul Delaroche declared that from today, painting is dead. Fortunately, he was wrong, but it was enhanced somewhat. 2 19th century voices, I think, show this dichotomy very well. John Ruskin talked about art as being fleeting, as something which enlightened the incomprehensible, incorporated things that have no measure, and immortalized things that have no duration. Less expressive about art, but more about realism, was Leo Tolstoy. When we talked about realism with Dostoevsky, let's think about Tolstoy as his compatriot of the same age, too. That it's a human activity, conductive not only of feelings, but also expressing communication. And those 2 things, personal expression and communication, occur over and over again in photography. Dan brought it together with you in a stereograph. That's an important thing to consider because when you took a stereo view, you actually had two cameras bracketed side by side on a base. They took photographs at the same instant from the same position, but they were separated by the distance of your eyes. So when they were printed and mounted on a card like this, you had to view them through a viewer, and your eyes put those images back together, and you were given the 3D effect. Have any of you seen or held a stereograph or used it before? And then, all right, then you know something of what I'm telling you. If not, it's wonderful. It was considered a toy for generations, but it is more than that, really. It's a whole visual experience. It invites your participation in it. And much like what Dan was talking about in terms of the manifest image and the scientific image, so in fact you had two different points of view of the same thing. And as much as you could experience one or experience the other, there's a whole nother level when you bring them together. When the two come together and you're invited into that whole experience of the image. That's what goes on. And this is sort of symbolically what happens with those two levels of meaning. So the stereograph makes a good analogy. Certain qualities of the photograph are pertinent to point out. And these will all be posted by us, so you don't have to write down real fast or anything like that as we go. The first thing is, of course, that a photograph exists. It's tangible, it's touchable, you can pick it up, you can see it. It can be displayed on the screen of your cell phone, or it can have some sort of physical presence somehow. And that presents a whole inception of your work. I point with pride to the first photograph, which we own at the University of Texas, and it's on permanent display at the Harry Ransom Center. For years, this is the way it was reproduced by the man who found it, Helmut Gernsheim. The first photograph was copied by him and then much enhanced by hand to give it a sharper contrast, so that there you could see the image. If you look at the original plate, this, by the way, is the world's worst copy of the first photograph. I know because I made it, and I made it on purpose that way to show you that it has a tangible state. It's a pewter plate. The image is on it. It's very low contrast. It's got Mars and dents in it and things like that, and it sits in this gold frame. When we finally had it analyzed by the Getty in 2002 for scientific purpose, we had them rephotograph it. This is the new copy of it. We wanted to give people a sense of the image, but more than that, a sense of the object. This is what's critical about any painting you deal with, any print you deal with, any photograph you deal with. It is both image and object. Again, two levels. The scientific and the manifest. That is true with the photographic experience as well. So whenever I put a picture up here on the screen, as I'll be doing in my talks, remember there's a real live touchable object behind it. This, by the way, is the view out of that window currently today. Changed just a little bit. One of the best examples that I have of that whole experience of the existence is this photographic pin, dating from sometime in the 19th century. It's a small photographic pin about 2 inches high. It's a small paper print that's been hand colored. Over time, we have lost any record of who it is. We don't know the name, we don't know the circumstances for it. But to show you the powerful strength of the image and that significance that it has, all you have to do is turn it over on its backside and find a lock of the lady's hair in it. And that tells you something about the power of the photograph. Not only to represent, but to bring up other emotions. Because secondly, beyond existence, a photograph persists. It implies a greater meaning. It can continue to have that application, and that potential can outlast you in other generations. So that the family albums you see from the 19th century have classic poses like these. By the way, those again are hand-colored. We're not dealing with color photography yet. But they were done along traditional lines. In this very strong era of Dostoevsky's facement towards realism, What you have is, if you open the book and manual, it gave you instructions of how to pose a person. There were certain acceptable standards by which you photographed a person to make them look slimmer, or to make them look taller, or to make them look where you put the camera, how close and farther in you went. As the camera technology changed in the 20th century, posing in situations became less traditional. Marge, Homer, Lisa, and you can figure out who Bart is in that picture. Other traditional genres came and went. I'll guarantee you that somewhere in your family, your great-grandparents have a picture of themselves this way. This was the style back in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. You brought the baby in, you took off their clothes, and you laid them down to make a cute picture. On, of course, to today, where we all take the camera, we are situated in snapshots. We no longer dress up formally, we no longer necessarily go into the studio. A photograph can be made anywhere. Third is, of course, the fact that they have the power to evoke. They can garner a response, they can generate emotions and feelings, and they can suggest those things to you and to others. We see pictures, classic pictures from the 1930s, the Depression. We'll be seeing some of these later on. The dust bowls that struck the land and destroyed agriculture, and the poverty and conditions that went throughout the Depression. Those things within an image tend to evoke certain powers and certain feelings. And we've capitalized upon them in our own ways by sharing pictures with others. And of course, Hollywood even came along, took the FSA pictures that were done of America in the 30s, and in the case of The Grapes of Wrath, when they made the movie in 1939, 1940, dressed the characters accordingly based upon the costumes and the images that were taken from real life. That sort of power was there. This is the other side of that evocation. I guarantee you probably now in that cell phone you have in your pocket or your purse have pictures and snapshots of friends or family perhaps in them too. Generation back, we carried them in wallets with little plastic windows. Could look at it any time. This particular image, the gentleman who's looking at it, his name was Cherry, and the photographer told us that, as Cherry once told him, he said, "This is my photographic gallery." Carried with him in the hip pocket of his pants. But that power to evoke, to show the family, to show friends, is there. Also, the camera can symbolize. It has that ability to represent other things and provide interpretations that can be altered, transformed, and in many cases forgotten by that passage of time. In 1860, a beardless Abraham Lincoln was running for election for president. He gave a very famous speech at Cooper Union. That same day he visited the photographic studio of Matthew Brady and posed for this picture. This picture became iconic. It was a very big seller for Brady. It was used in wood engravings throughout newspapers at the time. And Lincoln always said that the Cooper Union speech and the photograph of Brady made that day were what got him elected president. By the time he reached Washington, of course, he'd already grown a beard. But that was the image that people saw, that they carried with them into the voting booths in 1860. Queen Victoria, same time as Lincoln in the mid-19th century, was photographed by the royal photographer of the Spanish Queen. And so in preparation for that, she dressed herself and attired herself this way. In 1860, this is the way Queen Victoria wanted to present herself to Queen Isabella of Spain, because they'd never met. So this was the image that was taken of her in the court, borne with her back too. If you will, it was a collaboration between the subject and the photographer. 40 years later, the roll film camera came out, the Kodak, everybody was taking snapshots. Queen Victoria's own daughter was taking pictures of her around the palace. Same lady, 40 years later, different power and feeling entirely. You wouldn't know this was the Queen if we hadn't told you, perhaps, or you hadn't known her or met her yourself. That's how transformative photography is. It can also, with the passage of time, evoke other things too for you as well, because in symbolizing the land, it can symbolize also other things about the land. This is Mono Lake in California, done in the 1970s. 100 years later, the Free Photographic Project went through and got the same size lens and found the same place, in the same place where they set up the tripod and take the picture, same location. What does it tell you symbolically about ecology, about landscape, about the weather? What does it tell you about survival and people at the time? Back and forth. Or consider Stieglitz's famous picture of the steerage. We'll get into this when we talk about early photography in the 20th century. But Stieglitz took this picture for one purpose, because he liked the aesthetic composition. The fact that it had no right angles, the fact that it had said different things in a very modernist way. It was very untraditional. That image has been appropriated for the last 100 years to show the huddled masses coming from Europe, yearning to be free, coming to America. The baseline for this photograph is that it was taken on a ship, leaving New York, heading back to Europe. Not Stieglitz's intent to show anything about emigration or immigration, but taking on its own context and its own separate meanings, sometimes false, in the course of its existence over 100 years. And finally, photographs are illusions. They're capable of persuasion, but they're also capable of misinterpretation of fact. They can be altered or transformed, and that transformation can affect other meaning. President Lincoln in the White House with his son. A very popular image, sold many hundreds of copies in the mid-1860s. So popular, in fact, that some of the photographers said, well, let's enhance it a bit. So we can change the background, or we can get rid of the background entirely. We can do some retouching on the faces too. And since that was so popular, let's incorporate the whole family in the picture too. So we put in Mary Todd, and we put in older Robert, and we put in young Will, who died in his picture up there. All these sort of things can be done to a photograph, not just with Photoshop today, back from the beginning of time. Dan stole my thunder with this one, but this is the famous Cottingley Ferry, done in 1917. That is Elsie Wright, one of the two girls who created this whole forgery. Basically, she and her friend Frances Griffith got their dad to load up a camera, went out in the woods behind the house, came back with photographs of ferries. Conan Doyle saw these and was struck with the power that they confirmed with him that there was a mystical, magical world. Wrote a big article in the Strand magazine in 1920 on the existence of fairies, campaigned for it throughout his life, because Frances and Elsie came back with this image, and also this image. And I think we also have the winged troll in here somewhere. Yes, we do. There was a series of about 6 of these. And it wasn't until Elsie and Frances were in their 80s that they confessed, yeah, they had cut them out of books and hand-colored them and stuck them in branches and in leaves with their mother's hat pins and photographed them with the camera. And they were just having fun. And suddenly it became a whole new thing. And inspired the father of Sherlock Holmes to believe it. Of course, you're used to this sort of technique today. If you're from Texas, you've probably seen this in postcards all over the place. The famous herding of jackrabbits. But even modern artists today manipulate real photographs to make emotional and cultural images that have a profound ability to persuade you. I think it's important when we consider manifest image and scientific image to remember that photography came from the sciences. In the Great Exhibition of 1851, the first World's Fair in London, that's what it looked like inside. That's a much and has colored engraving of what it looked like. Photography had its first public exhibition in any sort of large scale. Photography was not classed as a fine art. It was classed as a, are you ready for this, philosophical instrument. These are other philosophical instruments from the category of philosophical instruments. So see, we've been teaching photography all wrong. It's not an art, it's not a communication, it's a philosophy after all. You're right, Dan, we can quit now. Okay, at any rate, that is the way it was first thought, was the fact it was produced by equipment, by hardware, and therefore ignoring the other powers of the image was produced in that manner. Beyond that, it created an entire industry in the 19th century because photography became very popular very quickly. Because you could create images on different scales with different sort of ways and have different effects. If you were a serious photographer in the 19th century, this was your outdoor setup to go take pictures. A tent to develop your processes in, a view camera to set them up, if you're lucky, a lab assistant to help you. And of course that's a dark tent, you have to go inside and process and coat your plates and everything in the dark, because if you expose them to light, bad practice. The technology occurred at the time. This is the same time in the latter part of the 19th century as the rise of electricity. That has an important impact as well on photography in terms of lighting in studios alone. This is not lighting, this is a moon tower. Austin, by the way, is the only still existing moon towers. This was the first moon towers. They were done a few years earlier in San Diego. But by the 1880s and 1890s, electric lighting was used in this fashion. Also, the photograph was reproducible, and I think that's important to always carry with you, is the fact that you could make more than one copy. That comes out of printing. That comes out of engraving. At the first, the sketch artist made engraving plates. This is from an 1803 production of Napoleon's tour with his troops through Egypt at the time he was conquering Egypt. And this is the way one of his sketch artists depicts the pyramids. A little bit later, still before photography, they depicted the Sphinx. The scale's all wrong. Those can't be camels, but I guess they are. You get a sense of how the artist's hand sort of interprets the reality that is in front of them. Here's another sort of symbol. A few years later, still before photography, now the Sphinx has his nose back, and it's nice, English nose too. And the pyramids are bunched in a way they never existed, and they have a nice shadow cast on them despite the fact that the sun is setting behind the third one. And all those sort of things like that are going on in it. The camera came along and recorded reality. And you had such things as Francis Frith, who went to Egypt in the 1850s and got dust on his lens and his camera and set up his darkrooms in empty tombs and things like that to produce these mammoth images. That particular plate is about 20 by 24, and that's a contact print of the glass negative, by the way. But he set it up in such a way he had two pyramids, so he posed two figures here, he posed two figures back there, he had the trail go through there. We threw it. It's an elaborate composition I won't get into, but that's to give you an idea of how the transformation is going with the pyramids. The last major transformation occurred with the National Geographic in 1982. You weren't there, but I was. At the time this came out, this was a revolutionary cover, because digitally they moved one of the pyramids in order to fit it nicely in the gold frame of the National Geographic cover. It was one of the earliest digitally manipulated images that was put into a popular magazine. It caused great controversy at the time. We were playing with truth and reality. Well, heck, with photography we've been playing with truth and reality since the very beginning. But here it was in bold colors on the front of one of the great naturalist magazines. Nature, you don't tamper with nature, you don't transform nature. Oh yeah, you do. It's also a commercial medium, of course. I would simply use to remind you that it's been with portraiture since the beginning. If the baby wouldn't hold still, you hid Dad behind him to help hold him still. It was used for fashion photography, it was used in advertising, it was used to enhance other techniques. When William Henry Jackson photographed Pike's Peak and Garden of the Gods, he did it in black and white, but 10 years later his company hand-colored him and issued him in color. All these sort of ways to commercially sell the image were very important. Photojournalism and documentary photography began in the 19th century as well. travelers through such places as China, documenting the different trades, text of imaging of people in London streets, incorporating text now with it, if you could, in newspapers and books and magazines. All to the press photographers of the modern day. These are people escaping a fire in New York City in the 40s. To, of course, things that are more monumental, in fact, the March on Selma in the 60s. These sort of things are important to document in telling the story as well. Aesthetics also have a part as well in the very formation of photography, because some photographers weren't just interested in truth. They were interested in being expressionistic as the painters and the engravers of their day. In many instances, they copied painting, dead game being one of the favorite subjects. Or genre pictures. This is Julia Margaret Cameron's photograph of the Lady of Shalott and the passing. That, by the way, is supposed to be King Arthur. He was played by the